Hello, everybody. I am Ed Kramer. I'm chair of the SIGGRAPH Pioneers Group, which is an amazing, loosely knit group of artists, engineers, researchers, educators, anybody that's been doing CGI for 20 years, or in many cases, way longer than that. Every year, the SIGGRAPH Pioneers have a meeting, a gathering that we call a Pioneers Reception at the conference. The last couple of years, unfortunately, it's been virtual. The reception is a great time for the pioneers to see old friends. We have food, we have drinks, and we have a speaker, someone who has been doing amazing work for an entire career in the field of computer graphics and interactive techniques. And we've had some amazing speakers in the past. We've had Jim Blinn, we've had David M., Jeff Kleiser. Last year we had the amazing Donna Cox, who is one of the pioneers of, maybe the pioneer of scientific visualization. And the year before that, we were very honored to have Douglas Trumbull with us, one of the pioneers of the entire field of visual effects. So that was a great honor. What we're trying now is, because of the pandemic and because everybody is kind of now in a mode of thinking, well, how can we move forward doing things in the changed world? And so we're experimenting with coming up with panels that discuss some aspect of early CGI history that the pioneers were involved in some way. And so I thought that it would be great for the first of these events to focus on a period of time that seems to have been kind of forgotten. There's the whole tree of digital computer graphics, and there's this one lone branch from a long time ago that was analog computer graphics. And so what we have gathered here today is some of the original animators and artists who were working with analog graphics back in the basically late 60s to the early 1980s. What I'm going to do is have each of our panelists introduce themselves, tell you where they worked and what years approximately and what equipment they worked on, because there were three main companies during this time period, and all three of those companies, actually three main companies in the United States. Let me be clear on that. There was also a facility in Japan. There was also a facility in Australia. Those are not represented here, but we do represent the three American companies. Let me just introduce to you Susan Krause. And Susan, why don't you just tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
I'm Susan Krause, and I started at Computer Image in 1980. I had just left art school. I probably could have been an engineer, and I just really loved the idea that maybe computer animation was going to be a good combination of my math and science skills and my art skills. So I pretty much just parked myself on their front porch until they hired me, which didn't take too long. And I had the great fortune of working in the birthplace of this Scanimate computer, which made our facility much different than the others that were on the coast, because not only did we have to create animation to support our staff that was doing the animation, but often we were pressed to make additional funds to pay for the engineering to build other computers that were in the building. Well, I started out learning Scanimate from a really wonderful, probably one of the most wonderful Scanimate animators, Phil Zimmerman, who's no longer with us. And so he taught me my skill set. And then I moved on to Caesar, which at the time was being run by two different people, Dave Holman, who also is passed on, and then the other is a woman named Vivian Zazula, who still lives in Colorado. And at that time, while I was there, they were developing System 4, which was this big monstrosity. Most of the monstrosity was empty cabinet space, but they wanted it to look really cool, so it had these big Star Wars wings on the sides. And I was probably the first person to actually operate that computer as well. So I loved working there. I have some good stories, but I think I'll wait till everyone's introduced themselves. But yeah, it was a really fascinating time. And I love to tell people that I'm one of the first computer animators on the planet. That's my claim to fame. Female and that too, right?
That's great. All right, Fred, why don't you introduce yourself?
Fred Kessler. I worked at Dolphin. I went to school in Syracuse at Newhouse, and I was in TV, radio, film major and electronic music minor. We did a lot of Studio Moog stuff for music, but we also had wired into the video systems at Newhouse and create video imagery and abstract imagery. We would do these interactive, immersive environments for these avant-garde festivals in New York. Then I was involved, more in the direction of video, in the video art world. And then I went to an animation festival. Actually, there were two animation festivals in New York City. One was at NYU in 73 or 74, I think. And Alan Stanley from Dolphin did a presentation there and invited people to come down and see the facility. I came down with my professor from Syracuse, Joe and his wife, Joe and Patsy Scala, and then they were involved, this group of early computer graphic people. So a group of us went to Dolphin, and among that group was Ken Knowlton and Charles Surrey and Steve Levine, John Whitney Sr. And we went and visited Dolphin, and then we went to the Museum of Modern Art and hung out. And it was like the coolest place I'd ever seen. A few months later, found out the place blew up. And so that was the end of that dream. October 75, I came down for the third animation festival, which was at Columbia. I ran into Tom DeFonte from Illinois, the University of Illinois, who was involved in computer graphics. And he told me that Dolphin had just reopened and that they were looking for somebody to run the Scanimate, which I knew very little about. But because of my background in electronic music and video synthesizers and that kind of stuff, I sent them a note, and they were like, how soon can you get down here to talk to us? And they invited me to kind of watch, to get a feel for the place. And then when I went in there, I found out that because of my background in electronic music and synthesizers, I knew more about running the Scanimate than anybody at the facility. So I became like their instant senior animator. And so they were booking the room, Senior animator, right? And then, so they're booking like, major networks and ad agencies, paying huge hourly rates to work with us. And I had no idea what I was doing and trying to figure it out as we went along and faked it well. So that was it. So I was there for 4 years, from 75, end of 75 to the end of 79.
Great. Roy, why don't you jump in, Senior?
Well, hi, I'm Roy Weinstock. I started at Computer Image in 1973. My teachers were Red Daniels, Dave Holman, Jim Duca. It was just a dream job for me. I started off as a tape operator, and I couldn't tear myself away from the Scanimates. It was Bruce Harvey and Dennis Colminen were just wonderful teachers, and I just sort of took to it like a duck to water. I worked there from 73 to 75, and then the bankers made Computer Image sell off their production department so that they could pay off some of their debts. And I went out to LA from 1975 to 84. For a while, I was the chief engineer and animator. And when things got a little bit beyond my control, I ended up hiring this guy, Dave Sieg, to be an engineer. It was just a wonderful job. We were charging $1,000 an hour, doing real-time animation for television station packages and lots of sports opens for ABC and NBC. Image West ran into financial troubles, and I ended up jumping ship to Editel LA. And they had Scanimate and a System 4. We built that place and got it going, and we were the whole graphics department for the Editel in Los Angeles. In 1985, our deal went out. In fact, Ed worked there as well with me. And I ended up on the East Coast doing post-production. The company I started to work for, which was Interface Video, they actually purchased an old Scanimate and a System 4. We got everything working, and they couldn't figure out how to market it or do much with it. Also, that was not really the best market for those kinds of machines. Later on, one of my friends salvaged the keyboard from the System 4 when they threw it in the dumpster. And he said, I bet Roy would like this keyboard.
Wow.
So I actually still have a System 4 keyboard.
I remember visiting you in Washington at the TV station and seeing it up there on the wall in your edit suite.
Yep, it was quite a conversation piece.
All right, Dave, could you just introduce yourself to the crowd?
Boy, it's been a long time since I've seen Fred and Susan, seen Ed recently, Roy recently, but I ended up seeing an ad for Image West in broadcast engineering, and I called up and they passed me off to Roy, and he said, well, do you know anything about time code? And Do you know anything about computers? And do you know anything about video? And he said, well, we'd like to hire you, but it's a long way out here. I think Roy was starting to feel a little overwhelmed trying to deal with keeping machines working and keeping clients happy and doing animation. And I mean, at the time, it really was a crazy place. They were working round the clock, 7 days a week. Ed and Roy can tell some of the stories. So I went out and looked at the machines and, okay, I know computers. I'm not sure I'm up on analog computers, but I know circuits. I looked at all the manuals and the schematics and said, well, this is simple. I can keep this working, but I need somebody who uses this in a job to be able to come and say, well, this part right here is not working the way it used to, and we need to fix that. That was Roy's teaching me how Scanimate is supposed to work. I've got some footage that I found that hopefully we'll have some time to look at. Roy always did the best Scanimate demo. He could be in the middle of a job and somebody could come in and say, well, what's a Scanimate? How does this work? And Roy could do a demo and turn the knobs and flip the switches and make it dance and do all this stuff and then go right back to doing his job and never drop a stitch.
You know, we were also developing a lot of other techniques at the same time that Dave was very instrumental in helping us with. We did the step motors so we could do repeatable moves in front of the camera. We did time-lapse photography with video cameras. So it was amazing stuff.
Phil Zimmerman was like that too. Phil could just wow anybody with a Scanimate. He was very good. He made one of the most beautiful things on Scanimate is where he took this logo from Mexico. It said Excelsior and it looked like liquid pouring gold, and he turned it, the gold poured it into this beautiful logo.
Well, we're going to get into some of that work since everybody's gone around, and I didn't actually start out by saying I started my career as a Scanimate guy. I was hired at Image West by Roy Weinstock,
Guilty.
the same person who hired Dave. And I was really kind of the last person to go through the actual 6 months of training that it took before you were comfortable enough with all the different things that you might need to do in that room with the client working live and paying at the time $1,500 an hour. One of the best programs that has ever been written was when Roy wrote a program and all it had was a button and all it said was time and money. And since the clients were paying $1,500 live, when a client was having trouble making a decision, you just walked over and pressed that button and the client could see how time was going by and how much money they were spending standing there, and they red, make it red. So that was one of the best, like 3 lines of code ever written.
Management made me stop running that program.
Did
But
they
the
really?
best-
Freaked out the clients.
The best trick that Phil did that taught all of us when you got trained in Denver, and somebody asked for computer image, was it was in Denver, which is pretty amazing, was that there are so many knobs on the Scanimate that someone would say, can you make it a little bluer? And he would reach up to a knob that he knew wasn't doing anything at that moment. And then he'd turn it a little bit and say, is that better? And they'd look and they'd like, yeah, that's a little better. And actually nothing changed at all.
I like the color on this monitor better than that one. I'd call the tape operator and say, record it off of this monitor here. Okay.
One other thing that I just wanted to say about this group of people here is because when I first started at Image West, Roy was on vacation. So Fred was actually the first person that trained me on Scanimate, because Fred was replacing him on whatever project it was. And then when he left and Roy got back, then Roy was my instructor and mentor for that entire period of time. When Roy would train somebody on Scanimate, it was all this electronic circuitry. So you really had to kind of understand how summing amplifiers were adding multipliers and full wave rectifiers and sine wave and all, it was pretty electronic technical. One of the things that Roy did was I was working on Scanimate, I was trying to do something and it kept screwing up and I couldn't figure out like what was going on. And I finally realized Roy had to be inside, back behind the Scanimate, unplugging things to make sure that I could figure out what was going on. And I finally realized that he had been inside the Scanimate, out of my field of view the whole time. After Roy trained me on Scanimate, we were doing production. Me and Roy and Peter Cazzera were like the animators. They kept the place open 24/7, 365.
And Russ.
I didn't actually work with Russ. Russ Mail, the Wookiee. A few years later, in 1983, I got hired by Editel to be the System 4 animator. And then we needed somebody else to work on System 4 with us and to help us set the facility up. So Roy had hired me like at Image West 2 years earlier and trained me. And then I got to hire Roy and train him on System 4. So everybody in this crew is kind of all related from that period of time. People who are listening are kind of realizing is there were these three places: Computer Image in Denver, Image West in Hollywood, and Dolphin Productions in Manhattan. And each one kind of had its own personality, its own different projects that particular place was doing. Before we get into talking about that, I have done a little project where I've been interviewing people about their histories with CGI. And I'd like to play a little 10-minute video. And there's going to be a lot of people playing videos tonight. So this is just going to be the first one where you're going to get to meet Lee Harrison. Okay, so let me figure out how to share my screen.
Well, Lee was one of my dear friends. He became one of my dear friends after a very short time working for Computer Image. I was amazed by the technology, which in about 1975 was really space age sort of thing.
Well, my work at Computer Image was mostly design of analog circuits and some digital, and maintenance of the circuits, and also the cathode ray tube part of the system. Inspired by Lee.
You and Lee met at Philco.
Yeah, we were both working at Philco.
He was supposed to sign off any interest in some of the things that he was doing. He was supposed to turn it over to Philco.
Oh yeah.
And he didn't want to do that.
He didn't want to do that, his ideas. Because, Philco wanted the patent and had owned the patent.
Yeah, that was it. You and Ed.
Yeah, Ed was probably the chief.
Ed Teichman.
And I knew Lee briefly because we used to have weekly meetings for the engineers. I met him at Denver Research Institute at the University of Denver in probably February of '68. Well, we did a bunch of things, and one of the salesmen, Bill, I can't think of his last name, said, well, if you can animate the alphabet, we'd have lots of sales and so forth. So we used Animatic as a test bed to show that you could create a raster and then use a camera to display on that raster and move that raster around. It was very crude with the Animatic control systems. So then I remember when Francis Honey, who was the chief engineer at the time, said, well, told me I got 1 or 2 months and $5,000 to build a system that used a camera and rasters to produce animation. So we worked real hard, Joe Santastaven and myself, to build this prototype Scanimate. And we got it done in January probably of 69 or so, for the first prototype. And then we started publicizing it. Like that's when Tommy Smothers came on. I think, as a board member or something. Well, I was engineering, but I also did the animation because nobody knew how to use the equipment to create animation. So there were nobody operator. So I was the initial operator on all of the systems that we had there. Animac and Scanimate and Caesar, and later on the System 4. A couple of first operators were actually used to be cab drivers, Jack Wilmore and Reb Daniels. But with like Red Daniels and got to know people very well, I guess, from being a cab driver.
I'm Donna Sanastaven, and this is my husband, Joe.
I was an electronic technician at Computer Image. I worked with a whole bunch of engineers at the University of Denver, and they designed circuitry for the Air Force. Lee Harrison was starting up a company. They wanted me to work for nothing, for free, but that wasn't going to work because...
Well, at the time, I happened to be 8 months pregnant. Just quit my job, and you were already working for them free in our basement on, it was either a ping pong table or a pool table, we can't quite remember. And he would work nights and weekends. And I told Joe he can't go to work for Computer Image unless he gets a paycheck. So you became the first paid employee.
Yes, that was in 1968.
And Joe saved the letter, $630 a month with fringe benefits. I have no idea what the fringe benefits were, but it was a job, and we could live on that at the time.
Well, now that might actually turn out to be that you were the first person ever hired to make money doing computer graphics.
Oh my goodness, that would be nice.
Well, he was always a man with a dream. He was following a star. He told me about it. He was working for Philco Corporation in their research department. His dream was to do animation by computer, yes. He thought in terms of a mechanical kind of, I guess it wouldn't have been a computer, would it? But a mechanical device to do animation. So he became a mechanical engineer. Later on, he thought that was a mistake. He should have been an electrical engineer. He spent a day or two at the movies seeing Fantasia over and over again. He had Lee Harrison Associates, and that was the time when they needed parts, so they each paid $5. People were not paid. Nobody had any money. I thought that the first machine they started building back in Bluebell, Pennsylvania was called Animac, and it was done with tubes and wires. It started in an attic. The men would come over of an evening. This was when they were paying $5 a month. He was always talking to a lawyer, either about a patent or about a corporation or whatever it was. So he was not a businessman. He had to learn that part. We moved to California in '70. The office, the Computer Image office, was in the Smothers Brothers building because Tommy Smothers was on the board. When there were board meetings, they would come to Camarillo, and Tommy Smothers would stay with us because he was too recognizable to stay in a motel.
We might not be aware of it, but we're all watching more computer-generated television these days. Lee Harrison III of Denver was and still is a pioneer in the development of computers that can create animation. Channel 9's Mike Landis has a report on the animated computer.
This was the beginning of the Computer Image Corporation, and it was a rather unlikely one at that. The employees didn't get a paycheck. In fact, they contributed $5 each month to buy parts. The animation itself was simple, even crude.
And you notice we have many inputs here, and
Lee Harrison moved to Denver in 1965 and built his second computer, Animac, 2 years later. It was far more sophisticated than the first, and it utilized a unique electrical harness worn on the body and attached to the computer. When the person wearing the harness moved, the animated character moved. Characters that could be produced with Animac were far too abstract for an audience accustomed to Mickey Mouse. But clients did like the special graphic effects. So in 1968, Lee and his associates built Scanimate. In 1972, Lee won a national Emmy for the development of Scanimate. He says it's difficult to watch television without seeing something produced on one of the world's 8 Scanimate machines.
People would certainly recognize probably the Pepto-Bismol commercial.
Whoever you are, whatever you do, wherever you go, sooner or later, you're going to get indigestion. That'll be the time for Pepto-Bismol.
Indigestion.
Pepto-Bismol.
Indigestion.
Pepto-Bismol. It coats, soothes, relieves.
Go ahead and lay that down.
Right.
All right.
But Lee still wanted a computer that could duplicate the movement of a cartoon character. And Scanimate, although good enough to win an Emmy, just wasn't it. So in 1969, Lee and his team of video engineers designed Caesar. And according to Lee, animating with an electrical harness became a thing of the past. Today, Scanimate and Caesar are often electronically tied together to create animation. Animator Dave Holman sets up two keyframes, punches a button, and the computer does all the tedious work in between. And the future? A new computer animation machine called System 4 that combines the best of Scanimate and Caesar and does even more. It'll be ready for use this summer. But for all this wondrous equipment and new technology, Lee claims we've only just begun to understand the potential of computer animation.
You try to imagine what the world would be like if all of a sudden today, all of us for the first time were given vocal cords to speak with so that we could communicate this way. Well, I think we're in the process of being given some servant of the visual imagination that will allow us to communicate in a very marvelous and exciting way.
Very nice.
So
That was really fun.
Susan, you actually got to work with Lee, right?
And well, some of the other people here did too, but I like to tell at least one or two small stories about Lee. I mean, Lee and Phil actually had a reasonably argumentative relationship. You know, there was a lot of door slamming sometimes when they had conversations, but everybody wanted System 4 to get done sooner. And one day Lee called all of us into the back room. So when you came into computer image, there was kind of a front side, which was the production, and the back side was the engineering side. And he loved to talk in metaphors. And I was 21 or 22 years old. I was quite young. And we're all sitting in this big circle. And first off, he starts talking somehow about these red velvet jumpsuits we're all going to wear when Scanimate comes out. But then he's talking about, he goes, I know you guys are really anxious to, use System 4, but the baby just isn't out of the birth canal yet. And I just looked at it, everyone just was like, oh my gosh. It's so typical of Lee to have some kind of metaphor like that. But it was really fun because, yeah, Jim Duca was there, and I worked with Jim Duca for years after that, because I actually ended up at Ampex with Jim Duca eventually. And he did a lot of work, and Angie Duca as well, his wife. I worked with both of them for years. And Lane Graham. And then, of course, Bill Altimus was there past the date that was on your video. He was there when I was there.
Oh.
And Ed was there, and Joe Sanastaven was there. So all of those people were there, and we all got along really well. It wasn't like two companies. We were all friends with each other, and they would come in and talk to us about things they were working on and ask us questions. And there was a lot of back and forth in the design process for doing System 4. And so System 4 was just one more step past Caesar. There was only one Caesar ever made, and it was a little finicky because of that. But System 4 was only a little bit of a step past Caesar for what it was doing. It was a similar tape machine set up with, recording and having keyframes and things like that. It wasn't dramatically different.
Can you tell a little bit about what Scanimate was and how video worked?
I really think Roy's the person to answer that question.
Okay. All right. So Roy.
I'll give it a shot.
All right.
Scanimate and Caesar all typically went to videotape. They created a composite NTSC standard definition video signal. That was pretty much how they got to the outside world, was through video. And I remember in Denver, we had 3 2-inch tape machines. Lots of things had to go several generations or several passes. So we would lay down the first pass on one machine, then it would be playing back and the new Scanimate image would be keyed over that. Somewhere on the tape, time code would trigger something and the next Scanimate could take off. If you were doing three things, they all moved together. They were all triggered off at the same time, even though it was a layered process and it took quite a bit of time. After Animac, they were in color, and they actually had very elaborate methods of dealing with overlap. When two pieces of raster would overlap, they would tend to get brighter. So they had actually figured out a way to compensate for that so they could all three be the same color.
When I talked to Bill Altimus, he was quite proud of the fact that he solved that problem.
Yeah, it was a real weird solution, and if everything was tuned perfectly, it actually worked. But, you know, it's analog, so everything would drift, and then it might not work so well the next time you went back for it.
I think, you know, it's hard for anyone that operated a Scanimate to describe how they worked to anybody else. But for the audience who knows nothing, is basically there was a TV tube that another TV pointed to that TV, and we were actually manipulating the raster in the TV below it. So you were actually using this patch bay and applying sine waves, et cetera, to it to turn the raster into a ball. And then there was another camera looking at that raster, which was the output of the video. And then Scanimate on the front had a number of knobs, so you could use the intensity of the color to color the layers by turning these little knobs, by adding blue or whatever you needed to add. So that's kind of a very rudimentary description, but I'm
sorry, that was one of the advantages that Scanimate had over anything else that anyone had ever seen, was the fact that there was an optical coupling between this spaghetti happening on a CRT and a regular camera pointing at that. So that was our scan conversion.
Right, and that was the same with Caesar, although Caesar had it so you could section it into multiple sections, and each section you could animate separately and create a character or whatever it is you were working on.
Scanimate had that too, but what was great about that was because of that physical space, you could actually put cellophane in there,
right,
or mirrors, or
a star filter on the pickup camera.
On the camera. That's right.
Yeah, John Woodson.
And we figured out a way. Somebody rigged a star filter that could actually rotate with a stepper motor, so we could actually make the star filter spin in real time and get cool star highlights.
I think Dave made that.
I made that. I never knew Lee, and when I came to work at Image West, I was at a little bit of a disadvantage because Image West had been split off from Computer Image by the bank. And so Image West and Computer Image, in effect, sort of became competitors. And so
and Dolphin.
And Dolphin.
Right.
And so I was charged with keeping the machine working, but if really worse came to worse, I could call Denver and they would send somebody out and charge us an arm and a leg for that person's time. So I was left to pretty much figure it out on my own. That was the reason I didn't really know a lot of the Computer Image people until later when I did the documentary. I found this photograph. I know this is not doesn't show up very well, but this was the very first Scanimate. It's a very early version of it. I have a lot of material from back then, which we can talk about. It's going to go into an archive. We used Scanimate. We also used every trick in the book. It didn't really matter. If you could go in the control room and misadjust a piece of equipment and get it to do the effect that you needed it to do, the animators felt perfectly free to do that, whereas any place else, they would fire you immediately.
And that's how we did some of the best trail effects with video feedback by basically feeding the signal back into the electronics of the signal itself. And we did some amazing, Roy did some beautiful feedback work on the Blame It on the Boogie piece. I know you guys had prepared some videos. Susan, did you have something from Computer Image you wanted to show, or?
Just this 3/4 inch tape that is not in digital. But Fred, I think it's Fred's turn.
Okay. Well, Fred, tell us about Dolphin. Tell us what it was like in New York working with ad agency clients at Dolphin?
All right, so that was Dolphin in the street. So we were in it, and this was the Dolphin after the explosion, the rebuilt Dolphin. So
You
this
guys
was
had all 5 floors?
Yeah, we had the whole building. So it was a townhouse on East 80th Street. There's a bunch of diplomats and stuff living down the street. It was a kind of fancy block. First floor was reception and then the machine room in the back. Second floor was Alan's office. Alan Stanley was the president. His office was in the front of the building. And the main Scanimate room was on the back 2/3. And then the third floor front was our studio, our Norelco PC70 camera. And then the second Scanimate was on the back of that floor. And then the fourth floor front was the art department. And then the back was like bookkeeping and business office. And then the fifth floor was a conference room and our 3/4 inch offline editing system for cutting demo reels. Then we had a little garden backyard area. That was Dolphin. It's one of the few ads I could find. In order to do an animation, it would take like literally all day, hours just to program a move. We were working on a Canadian Visa commercial and the client was in the back of the room and drew this illustration while I was programming the move. That's how long it took. So basically this kind of explains what life in Dolphin was about. So that was me. That's Mike Saz.
I knew that was Mike Saz. I was going to ask you if that was Mike Saz.
Yeah.
That definitely looks like Mike Saz.
Yeah. And that's Bruce Davis there. And that's Leon, who was the porter for the block. But he worked in the building and he was a really amazing character. So this was like the craziness of that room. So this is from the perspective of the client. This is the demo reels that were being cut and dubbed downstairs. You know, it's the Pepto spot, the CBS stuff. And this was the rescan camera. And this kind of shows the energy and insanity of there. Alan Stanley's office, I said, was on the other side of the floor. And he was very adamant anti-smoker and everyone smoked back then. So there's all this comments about the cigarettes and smoke and everything in the room. But okay, and that is, well, actually up here, these are the patch fields. That's the top patch field, that's a square one, and the bottom patch field. These are the layouts I just found that explains everything. This little table that next to me, first was a Bible, that was my notebook. Every job I had to document all my patches because if we ever came back and did revisions, I had to figure out at least to get close to where we were. These are the different ramps. You would multiply and add signals. And so this would modulate the images. These would be used to cut down the amount of animation on the top of the body or the bottom of the body. So you could control down the rest or how intense the animation was. I should go back to the actual reel.
Remember one thing about the next 2 words. Never have one without the other. Indigestion. Pepto-Bismol.
Indigestion.
Pepto-Bismol. Indigestion. Pepto-Bismol. It coats, soothes, relieves.
With that patch, you could see that the distortion was more on the bottom part of his body and it was restricted on the top. So its entire body didn't just expand and go back. It was just controlled that way. And these were also pre-composites. It was a photograph and then we'd shoot the guy in the studio against the background, lay that on tape, play that back. And then when we did these spots, it all had to be animated live to the actor. So when the actor would say Inda, I would ramp it up and Justin ramp it down. And the later ones, we would have both Scanimates going. We would feed the luminous channel of the camera to the top Scanimate, and that would be the key. And then the bottom would be the fill. I'd have trunk lines and animate both Scanimate rasters simultaneously. And it all had to be done live. So if I messed up the animation, he had to redo the line because we didn't want to lose quality by putting it down on tape and playing it back. Plus, we couldn't key really off tape. It had to be keyed live. And see, it has like a bit of an edge on it, but the one that you played from computer image video actually had this same scene, but with a cleaner key edge. I couldn't find that spot. I can't get it off tape. I've been, grabbing this stuff from YouTube. That was the famous Pepto wipe. So that was just modulating raster as it went down and put a little out of focus to give the gradation. It's also kind of cool when, you see like your stuff in the papers. So it's kind of reached the culture. The next spot is the Foot Locker, which is probably the first Clio for computer animation. It was for best US TV graphics.
For the athlete who's serious about his footwork, now there's a place that's serious about his footwear. A place with more kinds of shoes for more kinds of sports than any place else. It's a new kind of shoe store. It's the Foot Locker. Whatever your game is, we go for the big names. Like Adidas, Nike, Puma, Tiger, Treetorn, Converse, all the action at the Foot Locker. Now there are 9 around Los Angeles. Call this number for the nearest one. Get moving.
So again, that's it. These are pulled off of YouTube, so the quality is pretty bad. That was all footage offset with the position, Scanimate, colorized. And then this is for local disco spot, WKTU.
New York's disco radio is Disco 92. Disco 92, only on WKTU, FM 92.
So this is sweet.
Harry Reisner, Barbara Walters, bring you the news.
Good evening.
And then again, you know, seeing it show up in Doonesbury, it's kind of cool. And a wipe element for the NBC logo. So what was white was footage, and it you know, restricted it back in, and then the logo filled it up. And then Nebraska Educational Television pointed out the fact that they've been using this logo for years, so it didn't last very long. And this is also like what Roy was talking about with the different layers and layers. So we would size it back and then offset it, in time each move, and we would.
It was very painstaking.
Yeah.
It really was. And I think a point that hasn't been made is this was not a 3D system. This was all just a 2D raster on a screen, and you couldn't build 3-dimensional objects. That had not happened yet.
Well, okay.
Well, and furthermore, it was not color.
And it was not.
And it's not color. That's why Reason of Walters, it was all like monochrome pictures until it dissolved to the color picture. But this actually, it's funny you say that now, because this next spot is 3D. This was for Rede Globo, the Brazilian TV network. The Scanimate was not 3D, so that actually was a 3D crystal model that they brought up from Brazil that we put on a turntable and animated and stuff, and then put Scanimate graphics with it and offset it in the Scanimate.
One common trick that we used at Image West was to cut a logo out of balsa wood and then paint the front face white and paint the sides gray. And then we used a dowel and a stepper motor to rotate it, and we keyed a Scanimate texture into the white surface and another one into the gray surface, and then you had a 3D logo.
I've got one right here.
That's great.
That's how you make something 3D.
Right.
That's
We
it.
did a
That's
thing
it.
where we layered slices of a camera, and then we stretched them just using Caesar and turned it, and it looked, it was kind of like a CAT scan of a camera, right? And then we also did one of the things that we did was one of the people came in and wanted to do a music video. It was probably one of the first music videos ever made. And the guy, his name was Chuck something, man, he loved computer image, and he really wanted us to do characters. And so we used, the wrapping to make the balls and the head with Caesar and make a little character. And it looks 3D, even though it's not 3D, because you're distorting the raster in a 3-dimensional way.
So this is also part of the Rede Globo Brazil package for one of their shows, Domingo Aventura. And then this is from a package for TV Espanol. And this guy would come in, and Alan sold him on doing backgrounds. It was like a half an hour's worth of backgrounds, figuring that we do like a pattern for 30 seconds and another pattern, and you get this was his how we would do time. We do always layers and layers. So like 10 seconds would take hours. And we had like a half an hour of stuff work to do for him. So it didn't work out. Oh, and then, yeah, and at one point he said to me and Mike, "Aren't you glad when I come in because you make all this overtime?" Oh, and the star field, that was, we used to put salt crystals on velour and put it under the graphics camera and then zoom it through.
Oh, that's
the sine cosine star field thing was just, it was too regular looking. So we just went for the brute force approach for that.
We never used artwork for our star fields in Denver.
Right. Yeah, we just used salt.
Looks pretty good.
And then this was also for the same, this is a commercial for Spain, but it was from the same guys. And
Titan-Lux, el esmalte sintético. Terminado, ¿qué te parece? Todo es posible con Titan-Lux.
And that was the machine room on the first floor, the back of the first floor. So it was the IBC 9000 decks. And then this last piece was for the New York City Ballet. We did these projections on these screens that we used behind them. And this is for Stravinsky's Histoire de Soldat. I can't speak French to save me, but so I never got to see this, but there were like 3 things that we did this kind of thing for. We did New York City Ballet, and then this band called Rush, a Canadian rock band. They had a song called Cygnus X1 and a rocket flying through the whole black hole. And that's actually that we did a 3D model of the rocket for that. But and then we did backgrounds for a Broadway musical called Got to Go Disco, which was actually, they talk about, there's a series on Netflix on Halston where they talk about, because Joe Euler, who's Halston's designer, it was his show, so he came in and worked with us for weeks on doing all the graphics and everything and animating it. The show, like, it was like the producers, it like opened and closed the same, the first week, and Alan was promised points in the show instead of getting paid for the production. So, but didn't you ever see the producers?
Those dancing girls looked a little bit like the piece that Rich Froman was working on with
Ron Hayes. I was going to say the same thing.
Yeah, that Alice Cooper movie.
Huh, no.
Oh,
Yeah,
that was Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
I'm confused. Okay.
Robert Stigwood.
There you go.
The other thing on this, I just want to point out here is that we had a panel here that was all remote switches for the IBC 9000s, because there was no CMX editing, there was no machine control, there was not even time code control really. So he had like buttons for play, stop, rewind, fast forward, but he would, like, in order to sync the machines, he would hold down the play button and bounce the stop button, and it would stop, start, stop, start, because the IBC 9000s were all vacuum suspended tape path, so that you could do that without stretching the tape or messing around with it. And we had a sweep second hand clock, so the hand would sweep once every second. It was like a timer that was on the wall there, and we videotaped that, and that was at the beginning of every tape. So we would have that, and then at the end of I guess maybe it was 10 seconds or 15 seconds, there'd be a tone, and then that tone would trigger all the clocks on the Scanimate. And for doing all the trails and that kind of stuff, was offset the ramps. And then so if he had to sync up 2 machines, he'd mix between the 2 clocks on the beginning of each machine, and then he'd bounce the machine in so that the hand would be together. And then if it was like just a little bit off, it means it was a frame off, and there was a color frame switch that he'd have a microphone and tell the guy in the machine room, hit the color frame switch, and he'd have to hit that, and then he'd bounce it back in the correct frame. And so he had, like, it was either 10 or 15 seconds to sync up the machines before the tone would hit, and then it would go and then record on the third machine. So the buttons used to always pop off. So that was this click, 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 click. That was the button bouncing on the floor here.
That picture tells the whole story.
Yvonne Paquette, he was our client from Canada. When you're talking about the competition between the three facilities, obviously I came in when they were all split apart. And working at Dolphin, I was not allowed to even talk to anybody at any other facility. Everything was very secretive. And so once I left Dolphin, then I went to Image West. I worked there for when Roy was on vacation. I think I went there before that with Rich Froman on a couple of projects. And then in August of 1980, Computer Image was building a system in Luxembourg for RTL. So their crew was out in Luxembourg putting that together and then initially training them how to use that. So I was in Denver for the whole month of August, which is a beautiful time to be in Denver. I spent the next 2 months in Luxembourg working at RTL, teaching them Scanimate and stuff. And we were doing some really crazy stuff there with it. They had a show, it was like every other Tuesday we do for the Hit Parade. Every Saturday they had a music video show. This is before MTV. And it was the only way they could promote music in Europe. And they would come into RTL and they would create 2 videos a day, one artist in the morning, one artist in the afternoon. And they'd come in and in like 3-4 hours they'd walk out with the video to promote their new song. For this one guy, it was Patrick Hernandez, he had a song called Born to Be Alive, which is a big disco hit. He came in and did his new song. It was inspired by, there was this artist, Woody and Stein of Asilka in Buffalo, that they would use light to deflect raster. So I took the light off the camera and to deflect the image on the background. So we had lines plugging into the Scanimate to deflect vertically the horizontal lines. The line background would dance and was a mirror image of Patrick dancing, and he'd be dancing with the Scanimate lines behind him. There was also an abstract piece we did to Weather Report that I could never show because we didn't charge for it. And it's like a whole monetary weirdness with Alan. Use the sound from the music and then use that incorporated into the abstract patterns, so the music would modulate some of the patterns that we did after.
So did Dominic Yaya work at all 3 places one time or another?
I was at 4 places.
Dominic Yaya would bring work to Denver, but I think it just depended who was available and who he could work with at the time. Did he come to Dolphin?
No, I knew him from LA, I think, right? Was he in Image West?
Yes.
Or maybe in...
He was in Denver and LA.
Yeah. And remember Red also when we first when they're bringing the second Scanimate, because when I started Dolphin, they only had one system set up, so they were building the second one. And Red used to come in, and we used to always have to bring in like a case of beer, and to keep him going. And he would just like go like all day and night working on this stuff. So he had his beers.
To our viewers who keep hearing about Scanimate, I just want to explain one little thing about it. The video signal is in old tube TVs. Now we just address pixels in a grid, but in the old days there was a big tube, and there was an electron gun that shot a beam of electrons to paint the raster onto the inside of the picture. It did it one line at a time, came back, did the next line, came back, did the next line. Actually, it was skipping every other line, and when it got to the bottom, it would come back and fill in the missing lines. And it was doing that very fast so that you saw it as a total picture, but that beam of electrons was being driven by electromagnets that were inside this gun. And that's what was being manipulated. The signal was a signal to those electromagnets that instead of drawing the image like this, and then coming back and doing it like this, and then coming back and doing it like this, you could control that raster. So you could control how it drew those lines onto the screen. And basically the voltages that we were creating were just affecting the little electromagnets that were controlling this beam of electrons. So we could, if you patched a sine wave into the horizontal parameter, well, then the whole image moved left to right. And if you did it faster, it moved left to right at a higher frequency. It moved left to right faster, and you could get really high frequencies in which you would get all these patterns of just what we called spaghetti.
Lee got the original idea for Scanimate because in the old tube TVs, when you turned the power off, the picture would stay up there and it would shrink down to a dot. And he was like, if it can do that and I can see it on my TV, how can I make it so that we can record that? Well, you can't do that to everybody's TV. So you have to do it to a little tiny CRT that you then rephotograph with a TV camera.
If you have a sine wave, it's going to move it gently left to right. But if you have a triangle wave, then it's going to just go linear, pop, 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 pop. It's going to bounce back and forth. And if you use a square wave, it's going to pop from one place to the next, to the next, to the next. And you had control of horizontal, you had control of vertical, and there was something called depth, but it wasn't really depth.
That was horizontal
and vertical.
Just the two together.
Yeah,
together. But also with that, when you modulate it, if the oscillator is multiples of the scan rate, so if it scans 30 times a second, then you bring in the oscillator and it's multiples of that, then that's where it gets curved, because the time it takes it to come down, the oscillator's to the right, and then by the time it's in the middle, it's in the left, and then at the bottom it's the right again. So that's how you get those curves. And then the higher frequencies, the more scrambled it becomes.
I've got a tape that I'd like to show because it has Roy doing a little bit of his introduction to Scanimate that shows.
Let's see this.
Go for it.
His famous demo.
There we go.
If you want us to hear the audio, you probably have to click on share audio.
This has no audio.
Okay.
So this is actually Russ male that looks like a Wookiee. And I slowed it down a little bit. This is from one of the earlier demo reels, but you saw the room there with the Scanimate on either side and the switchers in the center. There's Sam Price at the IVC 9000.
Did he ever make it out of South America?
Yes, he did. He was living in Miami last I heard.
Oh, wow.
That's Gary McKinnon.
Gary McKinnon.
Yes.
Gary's on this call. I know. we've been emailing.
I can't
Sam was the
emphasize
Dolphin before Image West.
the importance of these storyboards and planning an animation and having
those two guys.
Who are those two guys, Roy?
Some snot-nosed kid that we hired. I don't know.
Yeah, he's got dark hair. I don't wear the glasses anymore. I got that fixed.
There's Sonny.
White Swan.
You called the White Swan at Image West?
Well, both of ours were white. I forgot their names. What was White Swan and Black Beauty was a couple of them.
Oh, okay. Dolphin, it was White Swan and Black Pearl.
Oh, maybe so. I could be wrong. It's been a
That's
while.
a Dolphin, but I didn't know if you did it in LA.
So this is what it was like, guys, when we were working sessions. Sonny there is playing the role of client. The client would sit there, and the client was paying $1,500 an hour, and me or Roy or Peter Kazera had to just do whatever the storyboard showed in real time in the hot seat with the client staring right at us. And this is where that program that Roy wrote came in really handy when clients had a hard time making decisions.
Also, the way it works is that the artwork would be put on a light table, and there'd be a camera hanging from a pole looking down at that light table, and the output of that camera would go into the CRT
I'm gonna back up just a little bit. There's the light table.
Yeah. Now at Dolphin,
that's the artwork, and the artwork is made so that it can be broken into segments according to the scan lines.
And it was high res.
It was high res and high contrast codal.
Yeah, it was. And the camera was also a high res camera.
Yeah.
And then the NTSC camera was looking at that. Also at Dolphin though, we were on 80th and Lexington, so there was a subway that would run under the building. So if the subway passed, the art would shake, and then we'd have to redo the take. So in addition to the power supplies drifting and nothing being able to repeat anything, we had the subways also. So it's a bit of a challenge.
We didn't have that at Image West.
No.
This part right here shows what Ed was talking about, where applying an oscillator to the Scanimate scan, you can warp the original artwork around. And Roy can probably tell you what he's doing here, but.
So
the
there
famous
were
cherry switcher.
And then that would be colorized based on the grayscale that the rescan camera saw.
You had 5 levels to slice for the colors.
Jim Ryan at the Grass Valley switcher.
And if anybody doesn't recognize that switcher, watch Star Wars, because it's the exact same switcher that they used to activate the Death Star.
So we only had that switcher that's in front of Roy there, the CI switcher.
And we had a tablet, so that I built some D to A converters for the Apple that would feed the Scanimate. So you could actually position the beam with this.
Well, it was great for like making a sparkle, and you could actually position the sparkle while you actually saw it over the background. And when you press down, it would actually record those coordinates in a buffer. And then it could play those back at any rate you wanted. So you could have the sparkles travel across the word or do a write-on, anything like that. So that was really
Howe.
Jim Howe, yes. 2 IVC 9000s.
Tom Dosh.
Wow.
And those reels of video were heavy, guys. That's 2 inches thick. You walked around with one of those, it was like 20 pounds.
All I have to say is you guys had much nicer Scanimates than we had in Denver. We got the production quality one.
Well, you had the development version.
We had the development version, and it was much more rudimentary in look and feel.
Well, except that it actually did more. I mean, you know, you guys had the mouth circuit working before we did.
This is our R&D lab. That's me.
I'm thinking that you guys had so many great minds that had so many great ideas that you did. Every location did things a little bit differently, and then their own little tricks, their own little bag of tricks.
John Penny, isn't it?
Cliff Brown.
Cliff Brown, there you go. Wow.
That looks great.
All right, well, that's all I've got.
That was a fun tape, Dave.
Yeah,
Cool,
nice.
that was great. You've got a tape, Roy, also, don't you?
I think that I do. One of the things that I wanted to talk about was the differences between, here we go. The differences between the old technology and the new technology. I've kept on dabbling in animation, and today I'm playing with Blender, which is all digital. It runs all on a PC. It's amazing. Some of the samples I have may help the audience understand a little bit better about how some of this stuff works and how it compares with what we're doing today. So one of my biggest hits was working on a couple of scenes in Star Wars. And so this is what ended up on the screen.
Orbiting the planet at maximum velocity. The moon with the rebel base will be in range in 30 minutes.
It will be a day long remembered. It has seen the end of Kenobi. It will soon see the end of the rebellion.
Rebel base in range.
It will be a day.
So I wanted to point out on this screen, we had a character generator that could read timecode. And so we took this and we posterized it and stuck it in one of the tape machines, or in one of the Scanimates, and we were able to kick it over a little bit with an oscillator and make it look italicized. And it was reading the time code off of the 2-inch deck that was running backwards so that we could make it count down. I mean, you know, we would do whatever we could to make it work.
So great.
So there you go. One of the things I really enjoyed about the computer was all the blanking capabilities that it had. You could do wipes and all sorts of things. Using Blender, I tried to demonstrate what this looks like so that as it crosses 0, the state of the output would change. And if that was running to intensity or blanking or whatever, so you could do wipes kind of like this. I know, not very exciting, but I was trying to draw back to the
switch wipe,
the original way to do it. So the next section is mostly done on Blender, but it is what, and Ed already nailed it, it was called the switch wipe.
That's right.
And this is what it looked like when we did it on the Scanimates. The oscillators drifted constantly, so it was very hard to get this. You'd have to get it right and get it on tape quick. And then we would just record these as mats. So because you can never get oscillators to be this stable, using, especially like this kind of a move involved high frequency and low frequency oscillators. Just to show the next progression in animation is where now you can do this. It's the same exact path. The method of doing it is exactly the same, only now it's rock solid. And so you can do things that you never could do. Using, this also was a matrix wipe that I started doing on my Apple II computer back in Los Angeles. This was on NBC Sports a lot. And the year after I did this, they came out with a switcher that had this, you just push a button and you get this effect.
We used the Apple II matrix wipe for a show called Hot Hero Sandwich on NBC.
So everyone wants to know, well, why do you call it a switch wipe? Well, here's the answer. We saw this and were very inspired and tried to recreate it in our analog world. I have no idea how they made this. Obviously, it was filmed.
Film, yeah.
So that's pretty ridiculous. Because of the optical link between the camera and the rescan, we would put what was Sonny called it Thrill-O-Vision. We do all kinds of stuff where you put a reflective layer underneath it. I tried to replicate this using today's technology, and I got pretty darn close.
But there's nothing like putting the Thrill-O-Vision cone right in front of the lens. If you picture a cone made out of Mylar and then put on the lens.
You mean like this?
Yeah, like that.
This is also coming out of Blender. So having a Scanimate background has been very helpful for me because the principles are still exactly the same.
We had what we called the Schmutz filter. That we put in front of it. Yep. That would give us a nice glow, random glow around it.
Right. We had a drawer full of things that you could shove in front of the lens.
We used Vaseline a lot.
Oh, so slit scans. It blew me away to see this without scan lines in it. It just blew me away. So I just kept playing with it until I got tired of it. But it has the right depth, you know, it has the squared distance and all that crap.
But just so everybody understands, Roy, this is stuff that you recreated digitally using Blender to kind of emulate what we got poorly out of Scanimate.
Correct.
I wouldn't say poorly. I still think that some of the effects we could do with Scanimate are, I mean, it's amazing what you've done, Roy, but I still think analog is really just does
no, you're right. You're right. The resolving spaghetti effects are just amazing.
And you did that beautiful piece, that Body Human, which was one of the classic resolves from spaghetti.
Right. We talk all the time about patching. And this is what I'm doing in Blender, where I take a texture and I multiply it and I add it and I add an offset and I run it through a comparator and stick it into there and it renders out like this.
It almost looks like the diagram we have to make for doing a patch bay thing on Scanimate. Right?
Absolutely, which is, I think, really helpful because it seems very natural for me to do this.
So
this is a very silly example, but I was trying to make a paper tear in context. I have some photographs of those machines.
Oh, look at that.
This was
that's our Editel.
This is Editel, System 4 on the right, Scanimate on the left.
Roy and I put that facility together. We put that flooring in and brought the machines in. That was fun, Roy.
Yeah, a lot of bloody knuckles doing that.
Yep.
So the shipped System 4 didn't come with the wings, I guess.
No.
No, it didn't. But we saw that in my opening video. We saw the wings on it.
So this was the keyboard that they salvaged from the dumpster that I still have.
Oh, that's classic.
And it had so many little dedicated buttons. You know, this is old school where you didn't have soft buttons. Everything was dedicated.
But this was a digital front end to the analog guts of the machine. So
that's right.
Ed Marzola and Brian Ross, I remember them like yesterday.
I have a question for Dave.
And see, I have one just like this, Fred.
Oh, there you go. There you go. Not as, yeah, kind of.
No, it's different. This
Not
is
quite
Russ.
as insane, but yeah.
This is Russ.
Definitely.
Bruce Harvey.
I worked with Bruce Harvey at Ampex. I didn't know that he was out at Image West.
Oh yeah, Bruce is brilliant.
You know, I worked with Dave Holman, so he was doing a cartoon, you know, every week we had a cartoon from him. And my favorite one was he had the Night Crew, which was really hilarious. But another one was a decision by committee. And he had like 20 clients standing over the shoulder, which was not unusual when you're a scanning operator. Each one of them telling you to do something different than the other person. And you're just sitting there going, okay, who do I listen to? Who's in charge?
When I interviewed Bill Ultimus, he gave me a virtual digital stack of Dave Holman's drawing.
Here's an image of Dominic and Brian Russ. This guy's name was Carol. That's our fearless leader, George Haywood.
I see Henry Klein over there.
Henry, yes.
And Terry.
Henrietta Jordan.
And Henrietta Jordan, she worked with Chuck Jones at Warner Brothers. She had Chuck Jones' original drawings all over her office.
Dave, do you have the capability of like showing the Scanimate there, you know, like close up, like explaining the different modules? Happens to have a live Scanimate behind them.
Yeah, I should explain a little bit about that.
And we're talking about it, but it's right there.
Roy called me up one day when he was in DC and I had moved back to Tennessee, and he said, do you want a Scanimate? They're getting ready to put one in the dumpster. I drove a U-Haul truck up there and dragged this one back. This is the black one. I think it was originally at Computer Image.
Probably was, because it had so much of the wire wrapping stuff, and it was like a really development machine.
Yeah, I think it was the original R&D machine. I got it working. I took it to SIGGRAPH one year. I've forgotten exactly what the year was. It functions. It's actually on right now. And I have some other ways to connect other cameras to it, but not to work with Zoom. So there are a number of videos on YouTube where I take you through a tour of it. And I'm working on some other things that I hope to have ready in the near future that will be a better introduction to it. But it does work. It's built like a tank.
I hadn't touched a Scanimate in 30 years. And I sat right down at it and with muscle memory, flicked the test and invert switch on the camera and zeroed out all the commutators. And I kept laughing and going, how do I know how to do this? It's been so long. It's like riding a bike, I guess.
I don't know that I can do that. That's amazing. Cool. I just want to thank Dave Sieg for being such a good historian for Scanimate and doing so many good videos about Scanimate and interviewing so many people. It was so great to see both your videos, but also yours, Ed, of people I haven't seen in years that I worked with at Computer Image. So I really appreciate that you guys are, you know, keeping this going. It's really awesome.
Do you have any, Susan, any footage from Caesar?
I am sure that the tape I have here has Caesar footage on it. I mean, you can't visually tell that when you look at a piece that's done out of Computer Image, what was on Caesar and what was on Scanimate necessarily. But the biggest difference was that they added, you know, it's an old Sperry Univac, you know, tape machine that recorded everything that you put into the panel. So when you had the different sections that you broke down and you didn't have to use a patch bay. You could actually had little knobs that said, okay, adjust the horizontal or the vertical or the color or whatever. But all of that, you'd make a keyframe and each of those keyframes got stored on tape. So the next day when you came back, you could replay everything, which Scanimate, you know, once you pulled the wires out of the patch bay, if you didn't write it down, you know, you had to try to figure it out again all
You know,
over.
even if you left the patches in place, if you came back the next day, it still wouldn't work because the oscillators would drift. And
Well, the biggest problem with the Caesar was actually smoke. You were talking about people smoking. It's like we had to like keep the door shut, and Vivian and Dave were both big smokers, and you get smoke particles on that tape and you could lose everything, right? Because that was the only place we could store it were on those tapes. So that was always a little bit of a nightmare. If you get a bad tape, then it didn't work and you're losing client time when you had to start all over again. We had digital ability to kind of digitally store these keyframes. We actually could create characters and make arms move kind of, you know, when we did that first music video, I can't remember the song, but it was such a painful experience that I had walked into a retail mall about 3 months later, and I walked into the store and I found myself walking out of the store. And when I got to the outside, I'm like, why did I leave that store? And I realized that the song was playing that we were trying to animate the music video for.
I do have one good Red Daniels story that's real quick. I was sitting next to him, fascinated at him running Caesar. And I looked over at him and I said, Red, you got something in your eye. And he picked up a tweaker and he went right onto his eyeball. I said, Jesus Christ, man, doesn't that hurt? And he stuck his finger in there and he yanked out this big wad of cotton that had drifted in there somehow. And he said, oh no, it's glass. He lost his eye, and so he couldn't drive anymore. He was the cab driver, and he because he couldn't have a chauffeur's license anymore with just one eye, he went into animation. It turned out to be brilliant at it.
And question, how much did you get paid? When I got hired at Image West, I was hired with a master's degree in film production for 15 grand a year.
That's about my salary too. At the same time.
We were billing clients $1,500 an hour. So in the very first 10 hours that I worked on the very first day of the year, they made my salary back on the first 10 hours of my work. Fortunately, we got paid overtime, and we were there literally. I would do a 14-hour shift, and then Pete would come in and do a 16-hour shift, and then I would come back in and do, you know, a 12-hour, and he'd do an 18-hour. I mean, and that's how we worked. And Roy was in that mix. He was also working with Dave trying to develop the Versafex. And I do want to give you a moment, Dave, to mention the Versafex, but you know, that was crazy. So yeah, we were working well over 100 hours a week.
I was hired for $100 a week, and then it went up to, and then it went up to $3.25 because he wanted me to get an apartment. I said I couldn't afford an apartment. He said, when you find an apartment, I'll give you a raise. So I found the apartment and for $350 a month, and I was getting paid $3.25.
Wow!
And the balls of those managers, there were like 20 of us on the face of the planet that could have done this job. You know, there were very few people that knew how to run a Scanimate. Maybe 15. I don't know. Probably count.
But it was like the only place in the Eastern United States that did video animation for broadcast television. So if you wanted to do that, you know, they would have people would pay them to work there, and he took well advantage of that. You know, we were doing, and it was like people wouldn't believe. You know, I'd be hanging with friends or something, and TV would be on, and it's like, oh, that, you know, I did that, did that. It's like every graphic on, you know, on the networks, on the commercials. It was like they thought I was bullshitting. They didn't believe that we were really doing that much stuff. And the hours were crazy. When I found that apartment, it was 5 blocks from Dolphins, 85th and 3rd, and Dolphin was 80th and Lexington. So I had to be walking distance, otherwise you couldn't get any sleep.
Oh, could Scanimate Electronics, with all the patching, be comparable to a visual Moog synthesizer? Yes. And in fact, one day I did bring my Oberheim OBX-A into Image West, and I can't find any of the footage, but I patched the output of the frequency of my keys into the Scanimate and was able to actually play visual music that was being driven by the amplitude and the frequency of the signals that I was playing from the piano or from the keyboard, and it was driving the signals on the picture. So yes, very definitely comparable to a visual Moog synthesizer.
It was my knowledge of the Moog synthesizer that enabled me to pick up Scanimate so fast, because it was basically the same thing, modulating electron beams instead of speakers.
I do have another question from my best friend, Henry Labonta. Hi, Henry. He asks, did anyone use the Sandine analog image processor from Dan Sandine? And we've really only talked about the stuff from Computer Image, but there was the Rut-Etra synthesizer, and there were other analog devices at the time. I don't think those were used for production work. Like, you didn't have clients coming into the Sandine and trying to animate a toothpaste commercial.
Rut-Etra did a Drano commercial. Steve Rutt did Drano's commercials. He had an office above the bottom line in the city.
Oh, wow.
So they used it for a little bit of production.
I just want to share my screen. So I do have a YouTube channel, and I've got a lot of videos from our time at Image West. Look for Ed Kramer's CGI history, and you see there's a ton of pieces from those early days. There's when I got to work with Leonard Nimoy. Roy, were you there when Leonard Nimoy was there?
Yes, I was.
That was an amazing day.
You know, holding onto your money gets harder all the time. For instance, in a 30% tax bracket, 30 of every $100 you want to save goes to taxes, and you can't keep it. But Atlantic Bank's IRAs, individual retirement accounts, are tax shelters. They provide a way to use taxes for savings, so you can keep your full $100 and all the interest it earns. You pay no tax until withdrawal at retirement. Atlantic Bank's current rate of interest is 1% over money market certificates, with a guaranteed minimum rate of 12% for 1982. And now you can call Atlantic Bank's toll-free hotline for more information about these tax shelters, managed and backed by Atlantic Bank with assets of over $2 billion and insured by FDIC for the protection and security you want. Call us about tax shelters within your reach at Atlantic Bank, the best bank around. And best of all, a bank.
You can see some of these old Scanimate pieces on YouTube. I do a little blurb and I talk about something about them. This was something really cool that Henry Klein and I worked on for the show Different Strokes. We actually created this Space Sucker video game. So,
wow.
Yeah, this was a fun project.
This episode aired October 2nd, 1982, and was titled Shootout at the...
Looks a little like my Star Wars animation.
Yeah, it does. But what was cool about the Scanimate was because it worked in real time, Henry and I set this up so that we could actually play this in real time. So when things are moving around there, I'm actually turning knobs and controlling it as if I was really controlling a video game. So that was one of my more fun pieces. This is something that Roy and I had fun doing. We took this image of J.R. Bob Dobbs from the Church of the Subgenius, and using System 4, you can see we did some weird stuff to his face, and this is all being done in real time, and you can see we're warping his face in different dimensions. We're adding some sine waves to the face and wobulating it, for lack of a better word. But these were kind of the fun things that you could do with the System 4. You could kind of make pseudo 3D objects. And in fact, System 4 did allow you to create wireframe objects that were actually three-dimensional objects. So first time I ever built a three-dimensional object, I did it with the System 4. So wanted to share that with everybody before we take off. Does anybody else have any stuff that you wanted to say and that we haven't gotten to? Dave, you want to talk about Versafex?
I could talk about Versafex. I would rather talk a little bit about the work that I've been doing with the Experimental Television Center. It was a very storied institution in New York that a lot of people came up through working with Rut-Etra synthesizers, Namjoon Pike
synthesizers. Yeah.
Their work is being continued now by my friend Eric Daverlock in Atlanta, and he's asked me to help curate a lot of this computer image material because I've got pictures, videos, diagrams, and through the Experimental Television Center, he has a lot of equipment that had been at the center in New York that is going together in Atlanta. I know I'm helping him get some of this equipment working. He has a second Scanimate that I used to have, got a System 4 that's not yet back together. We're hoping we'll be able to get that working. He's got Radetra synthesizers, a lot of the other systems that person asked the question about are there. And if you want to know more about what's going on at the center, experimentaltvcenter.org is the website for it. So I think we'll see a lot of interesting things come out of there. He's going to have the ability to do some limited production. The funds, any money that's made from it going back to support the center. He's going to have residencies available for students who want to study and then work with some of this vintage equipment. I wanted to mention that Versafex was a system that we developed to try to come up with, I guess, Image West's version of System 4. We got one system partly built. At the time that happened, the Ampex ADO had come out and made it so that rescanning raster video was a thing of the past.
I was hoping to use it at one point to do full color video. It used transparencies, but full color transparencies, right, as the input?
That was one of the options. We had a flying spot scanner. And so if you scanned a color transparency, you got a real color picture out of it. But as you shrunk the scan, effectively that would zoom in on the picture. And the Scanimate always had the problem that when you zoomed in on scan lines, they came apart. It had some interesting things in it. I developed a full 3D rotation matrix, and actually I've got a new version of that over here in the room that I've been playing with. All these nice new circuits are much smaller and easier to work with.
Well, you've made the Scanimate behind you run in high def, haven't you?
Right.
Wow.
Oh, that's impressive.
So
That's
yeah, so the
awesome.
technology keeps marching on in many different ways.
Forwards and backwards at the same time.
Right.
So if anybody would like to be a part of this presentation, turn on your cameras right now, and Lou's going to promote everybody so we can see everybody.
Art Kellner.
Art.
Hello.
Hey, Art, how are you?
I'm great. I really liked watching all this and hearing all the story stuff. I'm so brain dead, I don't even remember.
Some of the pieces on my YouTube channel, Art directed. The Sears Canada piece.
I started animating and I was surprised to hear there was a 6-month program to learn how to animate, because I don't think I ever got that.
Yeah, well,
Nobody did. Nobody fire.
Yeah, trial by fire.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Is Pete Kazera on the line?
Pete Kazera is here.
Hey, there he is.
With Scanimate behind me. I'm so brain dead I remember nothing. I was great hearing what you were saying. I'll tout Dave for bringing Scanimate alive, keeping Scanimate alive. This background I did here, I did when I visited one of my visits to Dave, and I brought some images I created there and put them in an iPad and worked on them in an app. Image West was very, very good to me. And I started there as assistant engineer. I got a job there a month after graduating from Cal Arts.
Well, you had run the Paquette synthesizer, right?
I did work on the Paquette synthesizer for 5 years.
We've even got a vintage wobulator made by Namjoon Pike.
Art.
Peter.
You're looking good, man.
Peter, we're still here.
Yep. You were editing a comedy, weren't you? A comedy editor for TV for many, many years?
Yeah, after I kind of branched off, I went to a couple of different post houses and did effects kind of divisions to help them get started. And then, yeah, I did ended up starting in 91, I started cutting sitcoms.
And let's get Terry on the line here. Terry Craig.
This has been very interesting. My connection to all this was I graduated from college in San Francisco and came down to LA and ended up getting an interview at Image West. I had many roles there in the beginning. I directed a couple small pieces, and then I became production manager until I ended up moving to Editel. Eventually, Scanimate came there, and so I hired Ed. We started there, and then eventually Roy came on board, and for a while I was running the place, and then Roy ran it after me. Just as we were getting going and doing some really good stuff, they decided to simply eliminate System 4. That wasn't something they wanted to bother with, but unfortunately, all the good people who were there had to move on to something else.
I ended up on the East Coast.
You had a huge career on the East Coast, and you continue to do amazing stuff. I left Editel and started a career as an instructional designer, ended up doing a lot of training for high-tech companies. Just learning all this stuff has been really, really educational for me, and I'm very grateful I had this opportunity. And thank you very much, sir, for putting all this together.
You're very welcome. There's two people who are on the line here, and I just want to recognize you guys and give you a chance to talk, because we spent a lot of time talking about Lee Harrison. And right now we do have Lori Harrison, his daughter, and we do have Mary Lou Harrison, his wife. You saw Mary Lou in the video that I played initially. Lori, would you like to unmute and say something?
Sure. I'm just so pleased to hear all these stories. It's just such an honor to hear all the stories of all the work that you did. And the thing that really speaks to me the most is how much fun you had while you were working at Computer Image. I worked there for a summer, and my dad always used to make me sing at the end of the day, and I used to be terribly embarrassed, but it was part of his, I guess, way to get things done, was to have a lot of fun. And I am so delighted to hear that people who worked with him or with the computers had fun. That's the best that could.
Looking back, it was lots of fun, but at the time, it was not fun.
I do want to say, Lori, that your dad was super proud of you. And I remember, you're a little bit younger than I am, and always singing your praises. So he really adored you.
Mary Lou, can you turn on your microphone, unmute yourself, and just say hi to the crowd?
Can I do it?
Yes, we hear you.
Oh, okay. I just want to say thank you to all of you, especially you, Ed. I did meet Dave, and I think I met Roy somewhere along the line. Anyway, thank you so much. This was wonderful, and I know Lee would be so happy.
Oh, good. Yeah. Well, thank you for participating and sharing that with us.
I do a shout out to Megan Omi, a great
Megan.
tape-op, and Peter Kazera. I haven't seen you guys in years. It's great to see you again.
Also, anybody who's in the SIGGRAPH Pioneers, if you have an idea for a panel that we could do, we're hoping to do 4 of these a year. We do have a steering committee of the Pioneers group. Dave Kasich, who's on the line, and John Meads are part of that. So send me an email with an idea for another one of these panels. That's something historical, maybe that people don't know much about. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. I really, really enjoyed this. Thank you to Roy, Dave, Susan, and Fred for joining us here. And let's give everybody a round of applause. Everybody, personal applause.